get started. Dr. Terence Robinson, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Thank you for being here today.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's fun for me to talk about this topic and to interact with all of you that I've come to know over these last 40 years. I hope that this is not too long and too boring. They gave me more than an hour. I hope I don't take that long, and there's plenty of time for discussions. But it's a little unusual to have that amount of time to really try to get in depth about a particular topic. I've listed myself as the only author of this presentation, although many people should be listed as co-authors. Since I'm giving some very specific recommendations later in the presentation, I don't want their name to be negatively associated with a recommendation maybe they don't agree with. But I appreciate over the years all the work that I've been able to do in cooperation with people in New York and also the other researchers around the Northeast that we all participate in a plant growth regulator meeting every year and share data. I want to start by reviewing a little bit about what I think happened in 2021 with Honeycrisp. Now, in most of New York, there was relatively poor bloom in Honeycrisp orchards in 2021, but maybe we get a region-wide sort of phenomena going where many of the orchards are on the same on-off year cycle. Some of that's imposed by a frost in one particular year that sets us up for really heavy bloom the next year. But regardless, since 2021 was a down year and the total number of bushels produced in Honeycrisp in New York was way down, we expect that 2022 will result in very heavy bloom. And that will again lead to poor bloom the following year. That should be 2023 on the end of that sentence. So 2022 turns out to be a pivotal and very important year in what we do, because we'll live with the consequences of what we did this spring for 2 years. And won't really have a chance to correct it again until 2024. Thus, I hope that what we say today will stimulate you to try to really be aggressive and pay attention and be proactive in trying to manage crop load of Honeycrisp in this critical year. I want to review briefly some basics just to make sure everybody's on the same page. There are 3 important reasons why we try to manage crop load. The first is to, particularly with Honeycrisp, is to control biennial bearing. This is the biggest problem we face with Honeycrisp, apart from bitter pit and other storage disorders. But this extreme biennial bearing habit has very large economic consequences, and it also has fruit quality consequences. In the off year, when bloom is light and crop is down, because of the large price of this variety, its economic consequences to a farm's cash flow can almost be insurmountable. If you had a high percentage of your farm in this one variety and then you don't have very much production, your cash flow can drop significantly in that year. The other problem is that this biennial bearing creates huge problems in terms of fruit quality. In the off year, fruit size is too large, bitter pit is too much. And in the on year, often fruit crop load is too high, and then we don't get the proper flavor and we don't get coloring as early as we should, and it affects the harvesting and the quality of the product on the other end. The second important reason we manage crop load is to obtain the proper fruit size. Now, Honeycrisp has naturally large fruit size, but if crop load is too heavy, then the fruit size is smaller than the optimum for maximum economic return. And of course, if crop load is too low, then fruit size is too large for market requirements. Luckily for us in the East, we don't generally suffer from too large a fruit size. Yes, it's often a little bit too large, especially in the off year. But in the West Coast, because of a better growing climate, their big problem is getting huge Honeycrisp that the market doesn't want. And the last reason we thin is to optimize fruit quality. Now, in a separate presentation I gave early this year, I talked about each one of these individual factors, but fruit color in particular is impacted by crop load. Fruit flavor in Honeycrisp, fruit maturity, and bitter pit are all strongly influenced by crop load. Since 2013, we've been preaching a philosophy, a theory, a method of managing crop load more precisely. And the idea is, with precision crop load management, to manage the number of apples on each tree to a precise number that will give you the best economic outcome. Now, for Honeycrisp, we count that in 2-year cycles. That'll give us the best economic outcome in year 1, plus will give us the best economic outcome in year 2, because an excessive crop in year 1 that leads to almost no bloom in year 2 has tremendously difficult economic consequences. So I'd like you to think about 2 important questions. I think once we understand these questions, then it gives us more incentive to try to manage crop load precisely. First, what is the potential income that is possible from a particular orchard of Honeycrisp? And then the second question is, if you can define a theoretical maximum income from that orchard, what typical income do you get from it? And then the difference is, how much money are you leaving on the table? And how can you capture some of that money? How much money's on the table? I illustrate that with this figure that I've shown many, many times over the years. I developed it about 2006 or 7. It shows 2 scales. On the bottom, it shows the crop load going from 0 to 20 fruits per square centimeter, which is a really high crop load. And then on the left vertical axis is fruit size, and on the right is yield. If we first focus on the fruit size axis, that's the black line. It shows that in this particular case, it was gala. If you have only a few galas on a tree, you can grow pretty big galas, 200 grams. But when you start putting more and more crop per tree, you start getting smaller and smaller size. So that an excessively cropped tree will produce extremely small galas that aren't even big enough to go in 2.5-inch bags. In contrast, the red dotted line is the yield. If you have an extremely heavy crop load with gala, you can produce 3,000 bushels to the acre. But normally we would thin that down to something more reasonable. But if you overthin and get too low of a crop load, then your yield drops down to less than 1,000 bushels to the acre, and that then has strong economic consequences. The green line is when I convert those 2 figures into economic terms. The green line is dollars per acre, and I don't have a scale here on the side to show that, but extremely high crop load, the fruit is worth essentially nothing if it just all goes for juice. And on the other extreme of the green line, if you have only 1 or 2 fruits per tree, the total number of dollars per acre is extremely low. The interesting thing about this green curve is you thin from extremely high crop load down to something more normal. This crop value curve goes up rather steeply and reaches some optimum. In this case, it was somewhere between 5 and 8 fruits, about 8 fruits per square centimeter. But if you overthin, you stay up in the high point range for a little while, but as you overthin more and more, or you have an off year with Honeycrisp, the total crop value drops precipitously. The kind of numbers we're talking about are listed at the bottom, and I'm only focused on mostly Honeycrisp here, but just for comparison, if you produce gala crop with mostly bags, generally that returns in the $10,000 per acre crop value range. But if you produce 80s and 88s, it's worth $5,000 more, $15,000. So there's a huge amount of dollar difference between a primarily bag crop and a primarily tray crop of 80s and 88s. With Honeycrisp, the difference is even greater. If you have mostly bags, you can generally come up with around $20,000 per acre. But if you produce mostly 72s, the return, and they're no bitter pit, I should add, you can return in the $30,000 per acre range. That amount of money is what drives us to do precision crop load management. Now, I'm going to say this now, and I'll say it a few times, that the procedures we've developed are not so friendly. They require hand counting, they require time and effort. And some people just don't like to do that and get frustrated and say, that's not worth it to me. I argue that it is worth it because of the dollars that are involved. And if you ever are out there at the springtime trying to do what I tell you to do and say, this isn't worth it, just remember there's a lot of dollars behind what we're doing. And eventually, when we have more robotic ways to do the counting, then you have to pay for that service. I think it will be worth paying for that service because of the amount of dollars involved, especially with Honeycrisp. Now, one of the physiological problems that we face is that the optimum crop load in New York is not the same as the optimum crop load in another climate. We've done some work this year comparing 4 climates around the country: North Carolina in the South, New York in the Northeast, Michigan in the Midwest, and Washington in the West. And unfortunately, what we find is this relationship is different. The black line showing the relationship of crop load and fruit size. In a better climate, you'd have the blue-purple line. Now, that better fruit size at any given crop load is probably related to amount of sunshine and heat units that an area receives. In the Northeast, we generally have a lot of cloudy weather and not as many heat units. If you go north in New York, you get fewer heat units in the Champlain Valley than you do in the Hudson Valley. And so those differences in climate can mean more heat units and more light gives better fruit size at any particular crop load. And the problem is now the economic line shifts. At any given crop load, the better climate can produce more dollars per acre than the poorer climate. This is some data from this past year that we did with colleagues, Tom Kahn in North Carolina, Todd Einhorn in Michigan, and Stefano Musacchi in Washington. And there are 4 distinct lines on this graph, even though they all kind of jumble together. At each location, Honeycrisp trees were pruned to the same flower bud load, and then at full bloom, they were hand-thinned to different crop loads. You'll see that the Washington climate, which are the blue circles, has a line that's slightly above the other places. And so at any given crop load, Washington produces larger fruit size than does New York, Michigan, or North Carolina. You'll notice that the green line, which is North Carolina, had the line sort of below the others, and it had smaller fruit size in any crop load. New York and Michigan were sort of in between, with Michigan slightly better. To sort of illustrate this, I want to pick a crop load that is typical for Honeycrisp, which is 6 fruits per square centimeter. And if you go vertically on that particular line, you'll see that at that crop load, North Carolina would have produced 210 gram Honeycrisps. New York, the orange line, would have produced 240 gram, almost 250 gram Honeycrisp. Michigan would have produced 280 gram, and Washington at that crop load would have produced 305 gram fruits. The other way to look at it is if you want, say, 250 gram Honeycrisp in North Carolina, they could have carried a crop load of 4.5. New York could have carried a crop load of 5.5, but Michigan could have carried 8, and Washington could have carried 8. This is a physiological reality, which means that we have to define for each region what is the optimum crop load by running these sort of physiological studies and then converting it to economics. But regardless of that problem, I want to go forward with what we know at this point in time with just the little teaser here that we're working as a group over the next several years to try to define which is the optimum crop load in each region. Now, once we can define that, then there are 3 management activities we do in every year that can influence that number of crop load. They're pruning, chemical thinning, and hand thinning. Now, the first step in precision crop load management is trying to identify what is your target number. And here I show 2 pictures to illustrate this point. You have to calculate a goal for fruit size and yield that's based really on the potential of the orchard. I show here, it happens to be Gala, but this is a tall spindle orchard which is really filled in well. The trees are tall, they're at full maturity, and can carry a relatively lot of fruit per acre. This is a different orchard. same spacing, happens to be a Honeycrisp orchard, but the trees aren't filled in as well, especially near the top of the canopy. And so the potential of the orchard on the right is less than the potential of the orchard on the left. So in calculating how many apples you want to leave, you have to be realistic about what is the potential of your orchard. And one way to judge that is just really how well it's filled the space that you've allocated to it. In a 3 by 11 tall spindle spacing, trees that are not 11 feet tall, that the upper part of the canopy is not filled in very well, really are not going to have the same potential as a different orchard that has filled the space really well. I give here in the text at the bottom 2 examples. Let's say that this on the left was a Honeycrisp orchard, and I judge that it could produce 1,200 bushels of Honeycrisp per acre, all 80 count. At that 3 by 11 spacing, that gives me 1,300 trees to the acre. So to get that number of apples, 1,200 bushels times 80 per bushel, I've got to hang 73 fruit on each tree. And I judge that the trees, because of their size, can handle 73 fruits. But a second example is, let's say it's the one on the right, and maybe I've exaggerated it a bit, but let's say I judge that that one could only really carry 800 bushels, not quite even 1,000. Still shooting for 80 count fruit. At that 1,320 trees, each tree is only going to carry 48 fruits. And maybe that's the right number that that tree should carry. So I emphasize here that each grower has to make this calculation realistically, looking at the size of their trees in relation to the space that's allocated. Now, once we have that number in mind, then the question is, when we prune, how many flowering spurs to leave? So I'm using the example from the previous slide of 1,200 bushels to the acre at a 3 by 11 spacing in tall spindle, and I want 73 fruits per tree. So we've done a number of studies over the years, assuming, let's say we want 73 fruits per tree. If we prune, leaving only 1 flowering bud per final fruit number, that leaves us, when we prune, only 73 flowering buds per tree. And we've compared that against 1.5 buds, which would be 110 buds, 2 buds per final fruit number, which would be 146, and so on, up to 4 times as many buds as we need per final fruit number, which is close to 300 buds. So these are very different levels of pruning. The most aggressive pruning is the one that leaves the least flower buds, and the lightest pruning is the one that leaves the most flower buds. This is some results from one of those trials done here at Geneva with Honeycrisp, and it shows the ratios that I described below: 1 bud per final fruit number, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, and 4. The data is not perfect, but in this case, I just put a line at 100, which is the green line, saying, maybe that's kind of the number of fruit we wanted per tree, because these are slightly different trees than that tall spindle spacing that I described earlier for 73 fruits. But where that blue line, which is sort of the general line of that trend, crosses the green line, it's kind of the number of buds you should leave. And so it was somewhere a little bit less than 2. Anytime we left more than 2 buds per final fruit number, we ended up with more apples than we wanted, because this is the final number of apples. And this was done even though we thinned, as I'm going to describe later, in a 4-spray precision thinning program, where we sprayed at bloom, petal fall, 10 millimeters and 18 millimeters. Despite 4 thinning sprays, whenever we left too many buds, we ended up with just too many fruits. We just cannot overcome the fact that there's too many spurs on the tree to start with. Likewise, when we pruned too heavily, we did end up with fewer fruits than we wanted in this particular example. When we went to 1-to-1 ratio and then thinned aggressively, we ended up with only 70 fruits in this example. So we've settled now for a number of years on this sort of suggested targets. If you leave more than 2 buds per final fruit number, you end up with just a big problem. You can't thin it well enough, and you end up with hand thinning, but the excess number of fruit does tremendous damage as far as return bloom. So we've suggested that we should prune to somewhere around 1.8 flower buds per final fruit number. So I want you to just have this in mind. With that target, in most tall spindle orchards, we're looking for somewhere between 70 and 80 fruits, depending on whether you plant 11 feet or 12 feet between the rows. At 3 by 11, with 73 fruit as a target, we want 131 flowering buds. If it's 12 feet between the rows, then it's 144 flowering buds per tree. But I emphasize that the number of flowering buds is way less than 200. Now, one of the real challenges with Honeycrisp, we think we want a lot of flower buds, but as I'm going to describe as I go through this presentation, that is many times counterproductive. But I'd like for you to keep in mind those kind of ranges of numbers, somewhere between 130 and 150 flower clusters per tree on a tall spindle orchard would be probably the number that we want to shoot for. Now, I showed this slide many times over many years. It's data I took in 2013 showing that of 14 orchards in New York, what were the ranges of ratios of flower buds to final fruit number? These are ranked from the lowest to the highest. 2 of the orchards were down in that 1.5 to 1.8 range, but all the other orchards had more than twice the number of flower buds per final fruit number, with some as high as almost 6 times as many flower clusters as fruit buds. The average was 3. Now, this data was taken in an on year, and I emphasize that 2022 is probably going to be an on year, so I'm expecting that most Honeycrisp trees will have way more than 2 flowering clusters per final fruit number that you want. And remember, we'd like to prune down to 1.8. That means that 2022 is a critical year to get pruning right. Now, sometimes in the off year, there's so few flower clusters, we should not prune at all. And if your particular orchard is not in this cycle that I'm saying of 2022 being the on year, you have to really think about how hard you want to prune. But the severity of pruning depends on the number of flower buds that exist before we start pruning. Now, I want to talk about why it's so important to have the proper number of flower buds on the tree when you start the season. Now, there's 2 concepts that I want to introduce. The first is a generalized concept that applies not only to Honeycrisp, but particularly also to Gala, which is a small fruited variety, which often has excessive number of flower buds. But if you have excessive flower buds at the beginning of the season, when the tree wakes up, when it gets to green tip, and we start to have translocation of nitrogen from the root system in particular, but also carbohydrates from stored tissues in the roots and in the trunk to the buds. And not only that, translocation of hormones, particularly cytokinins from the roots. The tree has a certain amount of reserves, and it distributes those reserves to the number of buds that exist. When the number of buds that exist is excessive, it results in each bud receiving less than the optimum amount of nitrogen, carbohydrates, and cytokinins. And those result in weak buds. Weak buds generally have lower fruit set. They generally produce smaller fruit. And worse, they are often very biannual. If they set a fruit this year, there's no way they will have enough reserves and energy to flower again the following year. Now, we've done a number of studies related to this, but it really is critical. One of the studies we did with different pruning severities and looking at the buds you start with was looking at their set. And anytime we started with excessive number of buds, the percent set declined. Therefore, through pruning, if you can prune down to the right number of buds, you'll have reasonable fruit set on all those that remain because they have the right amount of nitrogen, carbohydrates, and cytokinins. I will pause for just a minute to indicate that you can take this to an extreme. And if you prune too much, you then stimulate those few buds that remain with too much nitrogen and too much carbohydrates, and you get the tree in a vegetative growth state. So pruning is a balancing act to where we keep the vigor at the appropriate level without allowing vigor to get too high. Now, in more northern climates, the Champlain Valley, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and probably Massachusetts as well, We generally don't suffer from excessive vigor with Honeycrisp, but what we do suffer from is excessive number of buds in the on year. So pruning a little more aggressively than what we typically might have done seems to be important. Now, the second important factor to consider is that the final number of fruits that you end up with generally is, at least in an 18-year study we did, is always related to how many flower clusters you started with. So you start with 300 flower clusters, you end up with somewhere 250 to 300 fruits, even though you thin aggressively. Because it's hard to thin down to less than one fruit per cluster. You can thin off all the laterals, but that last king that's there, sometimes it's hard to thin that down to, if you started with 300 clusters and you only needed 100 fruits, you'll end up with more than 200 fruits. Now, this 18-year study we did at Geneva started in 2007, and I carried it to 2017 while I was gone on leave, and my postdoc summarized it, and it had 4 varieties. It did not have Honeycrisp, had Gala, Macintosh, Delicious, or 3 varieties. And one important conclusion from all of those years when we put it all together was that the final number of fruits over every one of the 18 years was positively related to initial flower cluster number. Now, naturally, some years we had heavy bloom with Gala or Macintosh or Delicious, and in other years of those 18, we had light bloom, and we thinned every year with the same amount of thinning treatments, but the number of fruits we ended up with was directly related to how many flower clusters we started with. Thus, the third point, you can't start with too many flowers. Thus, precision pruning to get to the right number of flower clusters is essential. I'd like to just talk briefly about how we do this. One of the things I'd like you to think about and imagine that pruning, although it normally is done to hold the tree in its space and to open the tree up for better light distribution, one reason to prune that we don't often consider is that it's a method of thinning. And so think about pruning as a pre-thinning of the tree, because every time you cut a branch off, you're dropping some flower buds on the ground, leaving fewer on the tree. The way we propose that you do precision pruning is to do the standard tall spindle type of pruning. On a tall spindle tree, eliminate 1, 2, or 3 branches that are larger than 3/4 of an inch in diameter. The number of branches you remove depends on the tree itself, how many big branches are in the tree, because leaving a big branch longer than it should be in there results in the tree getting too vigorous. So keeping ahead of the game so that you never have to remove more than 3 branches, and hopefully just 1 or 2 every year, will keep the tree in the proper vigor range. The second step we do is illustrated by the picture, and that is to columnarize the remaining branches. Let's assume this branch is one that you are going to keep. If you follow it, it has a secondary branch here. If you follow it, there's a secondary branch down there. The main axis was cut off at some point, and this used to be a side branch. It now goes out to here. That extension branch was cut off, and now it goes out to here. So to columnarize it would be to take off the side branches. We would take off this branch here going straight up. We would take off that side branch going over there down. And then when we come out here, we would pick one of these 2 to remain. There's lots of options. If we thought this branch was too long, we could take off not only that vertical there, but we could cut it off here, leaving only this smaller, more pendant branch, and then cut off the down portion of that and end with that single column of spurs for a branch. Remember, each time you take off a piece of a branch, you're dropping buds on the ground. So those first 2 steps generally drop significant numbers of buds on the ground, flowering buds, but often in the on year, that's not enough. Often in the off year, maybe that's too much and we have to prune less aggressively. But in the on year, we have to continue with the third step, and that is to simply remove some more spurs on each of the remaining branches until we reach the target bud number. This is called artificial spur extinction. It's a slower process, but can generally be done by taking off buds that are pointing down in a rapid motion with your pruning loppers, breaking them off, or cutting off another portion of a branch, shortening branches back. Often on a weak branch like this, and there's too many buds, just shortening it back with a stubbing type cut does not result in vigor, but does remove significant numbers of buds, and often the tail ends of these branches have weak, small buds. So we have two options that we suggest on how to do precision pruning with Honeycrisp. I'll first go over option A, which is a one-step pruning process. This requires you to know how many flowering buds you have in an orchard before you start pruning. It requires you to go out in that orchard before it's pruned, sample some branches. We recommend 2 branches on each of 5 trees, a lower and an upper branch that are generally 3/4 of an inch in diameter. Then take them to some place where there's a microscope. Not many growers have a microscope. If you don't have one, often the extension office will let you use theirs. We do that in Western New York, and I'm sure Mike will do that in Eastern New York. And then you have to cut down each bud with a razor blade, dissecting it, and look at it under the microscope to see if it's floral or vegetative. So if you cut every bud on those representative branches, and suppose you cut 200 buds, then you calculate what percent were floral and what percent were vegetative. It's not that hard to distinguish them, but does require some training. And I'm sure the extension specialists in each state would be happy to train you. You can purchase your own microscope if you want and do this in your own office. But with Honeycrisp, this is essential. Now, several have asked me, can I just distinguish by my eye whether it's floral or vegetative? Possibly, but you're better than I am. I've been trying to do this with Honeycrisp since I first met the variety, and it just is very difficult, and I'm often fooled. So I don't trust that. But once you know what percent of the buds are floral from your dissecting under a microscope, then you multiply the target number first by the insurance factor, which is 1.8, and then divide by the fraction that are floral. And I give 2 examples. Let's assume your target number is 73 that we calculated earlier for a 3x11 tall spindle tree. You first multiply that one by 1.8. And so we've already calculated we want to leave 131 flowering buds on the tree. In the on year, let's suppose it's 90% that are floral. So you divide the 131 by 0.9, and then you'd have 146 as the total number of spurs to leave. It's not that different from 131. Now I'll just pause here that Mike Baisdow in the Champlain Valley was telling me before the meeting started, he's done a little bit of bud dissecting this year, and the little bit that he's done, he's seen around 70% that are floral. But that's an important difference. If it was 70 instead of 90, you would be leaving more buds. The second example is the worst case scenario, and that's the off year where there's only 30% of the buds that are floral. So you still would like 131 flowering spurs, but to get that, you have to divide 131 by 0.3. You have to leave 436 spurs on the tree after pruning. And maybe the tree doesn't even have 436. So if that's the case, you would not prune at all in that kind of year. Otherwise, you will be way under the proper crop load. But this is maybe one of the best ways to do it. It's a one-step process that allows you to go through that orchard with more confidence in your pruning to try to prune to the right number. The second approach is a 2-step process, and I kind of like this one. In your winter pruning, as you go through Honeycrisp trees, just do a normal but relatively light pruning. In the on year, where you're pretty sure you have a lot of flower buds, you can do just a regular pruning, normal pruning. That removes 1 to 2 limbs per tree that are larger than 3/4 of an inch in diameter, and then columnarize all remaining branches. If you're in an off year and you're expecting relatively light, maybe you just prune really light. You just take out that worst offending branch that it looks so obnoxious in the tree, you can't stand to leave it for another year because it's too big. But then at green tip, or after between green tip and full bloom, go back through the orchard and reprune. In this case, trying to just adjust flower bud numbers to the target. Maybe you don't take out any more branches. Maybe you just simply knock off enough spurs to get down to the reasonable number of flower buds. This is easy to do. It's easy to distinguish between flower buds and vegetative buds between green tip and bloom. I really like this strategy because there's no mistakes. in what you sampled or what you might have looked at under the microscope, you really can see how many flower buds you have. As a follow-up and as a quality control option, we really encourage somebody in that group, maybe it's the pruner himself or a quality control person, to come along after it's pruned, counting the number of flower clusters that remain on the tree as a quality control measure, and then either have the pruners prune heavier or lighter. So in this case, we just have this one example. We want 73 fruits. We're going to leave 1.8 times that. That means 131 flowering spurs. And a quality control person, whether it's the grower himself or somebody he hires, can follow pruners and count every 50th, every 100th tree that they prune to make sure we're pruning to the right crop or bud load. So this part of the presentation today, I want to conclude with these few comments. I think precision pruning needs to be thought of as a pre-thinning of the tree, and it's part of our overall thinning program. It complements chemical thinning, but it also makes chemical thinning more successful. Without it, even though you chemically thin aggressively, you can almost never get down to the right number of fruits in an on year. Now, Mike Baisdell produced a video a year ago or two, and the Western New York team, along with Mike, has produced a new video on precision pruning that you'll be able to find in about a week at the Lake Ontario Fruit Team website or the Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Team website on exactly how to do precision pruning. A second point, calculate the target spur number, and then you have to count representative trees after pruning to ensure that workers are pruning to the target level. This is the part people don't like to do. I've been trying to preach this concept since 2013. I get some converts and they last for 1 or 2 years and then they fall back into their old ways because it's just a headache. That's what led us to start this new SCR. It's not that new, it's a year-old project, to try to bring computer vision to the counting process that will allow us to both count buds and then to count flower clusters at pink or at half-inch green or bloom, and could potentially have counting done before pruning at green tip, and then have this rover you see on the right go after the pruners to look at what they ended up with as a quality control in a mechanized way to count number of flower buds.
If anybody has a question or two they might like to ask our speaker, they could pop that into the chat. Well, it looks like Mike actually has a question for you. Mike, do you want to go ahead and just ask your question out loud?
So Terence, I just wanted to check, have you seen through your trials, has there been any effects of the early pruning on bitter pit development at harvest?
We've looked at that, and if we reduce crop load too much, then we have more bitter pit, but we've not seen any increased bitter pit at the recommended bud load levels that we have been suggesting of 1.8.
Great, thank you.
I'll add just a couple of more comments about that. It goes back to that picture diagram I showed, that if there's too few buds, the amount of nitrogen the tree takes in is distributed to few buds. And those buds have too high of nitrogen, and therefore the fruit itself has too high of nitrogen. And the work we're doing with Li Liang is showing that the nitrogen to calcium ratio is important for bitter pit. And so we're on a balancing act. We don't want vigor to increase. And so by pruning down to 1-to-1 ratio, vigor increases. By pruning more than 1.8, vigor will increase more than we want. But the opposite happens too high of bud loads. We just have this huge biennial bearing problem because we cannot thin them to the proper number in the on year.
Thank you. We do have one more question.
Sure.
So how do you feel about Prohex CA at pre-bloom or for shoot control on Honeycrisp?
In general, Honeycrisp orchards don't need a lot of shoot control. There have been some people that have chosen to plant Honeycrisp on vigorous rootstocks like Bud 118, and we have found in our rootstock studies that that's generally a mistake. There's too much vigor and too much bitter pit. But on more traditional rootstocks, it doesn't necessarily need a lot of shoot vigor control. So the traditional timing of petal fall is less and less important with Honeycrisp. However, The earlier timing at pink has shown in some years to have some benefit for bitter pit. Now, Dan Donahue started this strategy while I was gone. I've looked at it since I've come back, and it's been a little inconsistent with some years, some benefit from the early apogee treatments. So I think that in general, we're trying to do almost everything we can to control bitter pit. So I still suggest that people do it, even though it's not consistently of great benefit, but it does help in some years. So now I want to move to the second part of my presentation, and that is once we've pruned to the proper bud load, then we need to thin as accurately as we can to achieve the right number of fruits on the tree, resulting in a relatively small hand thinning job, if any at all. So this leads us to the precision chemical thinning strategy we've also been trying to promote for many, many years, but in a real big way since 2013. It's all based around using multiple applications of chemical thinners to reduce the number of fruitlets in a stepwise manner to the target. It begins by using the pollen tube growth model, and I have to thank Greg Peck for bringing that to the Northeast to guide us in blossom thinning. It uses the carbohydrate model to guide post-bloom thinning, which really we have to thank Alan Laxo for. And it utilizes the fruit growth rate model to assess thinning results. And we really have to thank Dwayne Green for this model. Although Dwayne, I don't know if you're listening today, but sometimes people curse your name after they're tired of measuring fruit diameters. I think it's the most wonderful thing and a great tool, and I'll talk about it a little more later. And in each case, we then reapply chemicals if they're needed. We generally use this sort of diagram as a model. We know we count some representative trees at the beginning and know what our initial flower bud load is after we pruned. Then we start this sequence of sprays, usually 2 blossom thinning sprays of ATS, and I'll explain that in a minute, followed by a petal fall spray, typically with Honeycrisp, that's an NAA7. We determine how much NAN7 based on the carbon balance model. We then start the fruit growth model by measuring fruit diameters 3 to 4 days after that spray and find out the results right before the 12 millimeter spray. We then decide based on the carbon balance model at that time, how much dose to put on and whether we need it. And then we measure fruits again 3 or 4 days after that. And then second time, 7 or 8 days after that spray, hopefully in time to put on one last spray if needed, and hopefully get very close to the target fruit number without going past it. I said for years, it's like playing a game of 21 with cards. You take an additional card, but hope you don't go over 21. If you're really cautious, maybe you don't put on a spray that you should have and end up with too many fruits and a big hand thinning job. But on the other hand, you can be too aggressive and get burned and over thin. So the thinning decisions are some of the most critical that a grower makes through the year. And so it's really up to them to make that decision. I've put this slide up a number of times asking the question. Over my 40 years in New York, I've tried to push bloom thinning at least 3 different times with initiatives, and every time nobody accepts it. So I asked the question, will blossom thinning ever be accepted in the East? I think it will, because the addition of the pollen tube growth model is a significant advance. It makes you feel like there's more precision to the whole thing and you're not going to thin all the fruits off. It's critical to measure style length correctly. And I show a picture there from Greg Peck showing that we measure basically from the sepals. We don't remove the sepals when we measure it. We remove the petals, but the sepals is a measuring point to the tip of the styles. And we use that length in the model itself to calculate how quickly pollen tubes are going to grow down that style and fertilize that flower. I believe that bloom thinning is essential if we're going to conquer the return bloom problems with Honeycrisp. So we need to learn how to do blossom thinning. In the West, they generally use fish oil and lime sulfur, or lime sulfur and fish oil. But it's not labeled everywhere in the East. They got a Pennsylvania label and I think a North Carolina label. We've been unable to get a New York label. I don't know the label status of lime sulfur and fish oil in all the New England states, but because we don't have a label in New York, we use ammonium thiosulfate. However, ammonium thiosulfate is not as aggressive a chemical burning compound as is lime sulfur and fish oil. so that we've determined that we have to use a different threshold in the model to make ATS work. If when we launch the pollen tube growth model, we wait till it says 100% and then spray ATS, we get almost no response. But by spraying earlier at the 60% on the pollen tube growth model curve, we can generally get some response. It's not perfect, and it's not always as much as we would like. We almost never, and I would say almost because I've only seen this once, I would basically say we never overthin with ATS at bloom. Often we don't get enough. Now, the options for thinning at bloom include several caustic compounds, ammonium thiosulfate and lime sulfur and oil, and several hormone type products, Promelin, Maxell, NAA, and Amid Thin. Now, first focusing on the caustic thinners and their different characteristics. Ammonium thiosulfate burns the stigmatic surface of the pistil, but it also burns some pistil, or not some petals. So you'll see the influence of it when you go into the field after spraying. It can also burn some of the smallest spur leaves, but we have not ever seen any fruit finish problems, even though we many years see mild leaf phytotoxicity problems on those very small spur leaves. It always requires 2 applications, and in some years 3. But when using the pollen tube growth model, you can achieve a significant portion of the thinning job at that moment in time. It seems to have a neutral effect on fruit size. You improve fruit size just by the amount of you thinning, but it doesn't reduce the growth of the fruits from the chemical itself. It's not really registered as a thinner in New York, but it can legally be used at bloom as a foliar fertilizer because it's a nitrogen foliar product. And we have seen consistently that it improves return bloom of Honeycrisp. Now, lime sulfur and oil, I maybe won't spend as much time on. It's not registered in New York, but it is better at killing the pollen tube in the style than is ATS. As more reach back, it can kill the pollen tubes that have grown much further down the style. It also can cause moderate leaf phytotoxicity problems, but the real issue sometimes, in some years, we have some fruit finish problems under some weather conditions. Those generally are wet, humid conditions. And because of that, it's a little bit risky. I think in really sunny and dry years, it works beautifully. And it works even better than ATS. But in wet, humid years, it can sometimes give some fruit finish problems. We've tried a number of different oils. It requires an oil with it. Any sort of oil seems to work. Fish oil does work better. We've shown that. But soybean oil works well. Summer spray oils and even dormant dam oils work as well. I think that when you use a pollen tube growth model, you can have excellent results. But again, it's not registered in New York. It can be applied as a fungicide, but the Miller brand chemical that's available to us prohibits on the label its use at bloom. This is some old data that Jim Shoup and I did way back in the 2000s, showing the amount of fruit, and I'll just focus here on the number of fruits per tree when we had an unthinned control, when we sprayed ATS 2 times, or this is just 1 time, I reduced it to 156, lime sulfur 180, but significant reductions in number of fruit. And we looked at ATS versus lime sulfur in a different study with Gala. The unthinned control had 600 fruits, and each one of these ATS or lime sulfur reduced the fruit number by more than 100 to 200 fruits. Now, it didn't get us down to the 150, which was the goal in this particular orchard, but at least it got some of the fruit off, and it did improve fruit size. This is the slide I want to focus on about ATS at bloom. When we looked at return bloom from some studies, this one was with Honeycrisp, we found that whenever ATS was in the mix, we had better return bloom. So on the chart down here, you see the return bloom without any thinning the previous year was only 10%. When we used only ATS, but nothing else, it bumped it up to 45%. Our normal sort of thinning of NA at 7 did not significantly increase it, but increase a little bit. NA and 7 at 10 millimeters, a little bit better. Maxell and 7, a little better. ATS plus NAA, a little better. But the thing that worked the best for us was ATS at full bloom, and then Maxell 7 at 10 millimeters gave us about 75% return bloom. When we didn't have that, the next one, for example, NA7 at petal fall, and then Maxell 7, we've got only about 30% return bloom. So bloom thinning does have an influence on return bloom, and ATS is a critical component of that. Now, there's also a case to be made for using hormone type thinners at bloom to get some of that thinning done and to get improved return bloom. If you spray promelin type products, they generally have a small effect and don't have much influence on return bloom. Maxell, likewise, it has to have warm temperatures during bloom to work at all, but it generally doesn't improve return bloom that much. However, either NAA or NAD, when used at bloom, can have, in some years, an improvement on return bloom. It's inconsistent, but if ATS scares you to death, then use NAA or NAD at bloom. This last year, one of our great growers in the Hudson Valley had great results with NAD at full bloom and then NAD again at petal fall. Well, hopefully he will see good return bloom this spring. So this is my suggestion for bloom thinning. I really like the pollen tube growth model. I think a good, safe option is to use ATS. Usually requires 2 times, but you have to spray earlier than the model indicates at the 60% timing to get any sort of response out of ATS. 2 cautions at the bottom. Particularly lime sulfur and fish oil under slow drying conditions and wet conditions, or if they're frost, can cause fruit finish problems. So there's some years we shouldn't spray these products. And in some cases, 2021 was like that because we had frost problems widespread throughout the eastern US. So if there's a frost, there's some damage to the cells of that small fruitlet, even during bloom, and the caustic chemicals cause there's some damage to where those little cracks in the wax layer happens due to the frost, resulting in fruit finish problems. Now I'd like to move from the bloom thinning aspect of this sequential spray model to the post-bloom chemical thinning that include a petal fall, I call it a 12 millimeter now instead of 10 millimeter, and then an 18 millimeter spray if needed. So let me just go forward with the options at each one of those timings. At petal fall, you can either spray 7 alone, amide thin, or Maxell 7, NA 7, Maxell NA, amide 7, or in the near future, a new product called metametron. It's not yet labeled. I want to emphasize that what I call petal fall is when fruits are 5 to 6 millimeters. Now, the definition of petal fall is very vague, even for entomologists. Some growers claim that if they can blow off 90% of the petals with their sprayer, that's petal fall. Legally, it probably should mean when no petal falls are remaining in their natural setting. Regardless of those quibbles about what the legal point is, for me, petal fall is generally 1 to 2 days after the insecticide petal fall spray goes on. This often requires a separate trip through the orchard. Generally, when petals start to fall off, fruitlets are about 4 millimeters in diameter. At that stage, they grow about 0.5 millimeter per day. So 2 days after that, they will be in the 5 to 6 millimeter. And that's generally when we want to spray the petal fall spray. I'll define that a little better in terms of degree days in just a few minutes. But first, if we move on to the 12 millimeter stage, we have generally the combinations. Single products don't work that well. NA 7, Maxell 7, or where people are trying to produce a product without the use of carbaryl, Maxell and NA has worked very well. In the future, this metametron product will also work very well at that 12 millimeter stage. The last timing is when fruits are much bigger, 18 millimeters to 20 millimeters. We've tried many products over the years. NA 7 works very poorly. I probably should take it off the list. The only thing that's worked consistently has been Maxell 7 spiked with a pint of oil as a penetrant. Erythrol and oil has worked inconsistently. It can be a potent thinner if temperatures are high, but it can also overthin and scary in some ways. two new products are the ACC, or the product that was called Exceed. And some of you had that last year as an EUP. I think it will be available again this year in the same format that you can try it if you need thinning at this large fruit size timing. We saw in New York that if the fruit was over 20 millimeters, it didn't work very well, but somewhere between 15 and 20, it worked quite well. And then again, this other new product, Metametron, which will be called Brevis, works well at that big fruit size. So if I got really specific, and this is where I hope I don't lead anybody down the wrong path. If I were thinning Honeycrisp in an on year, I would start at bloom with 2.5% ATS sprayed twice when the pollen tube growth model says 60%, and then a second time when it reaches 60% again. I would follow that up with a petal fall spray about 1 to 2 days after the petals start falling, which is 5 to 6 millimeter. You're spraying 4 ounces of NAA per acre and 1 pint of 7 per acre. Now the 4 ounce is a high rate, but at petal fall, fruits are very insensitive to both NAA and Maxell, and therefore it's a very safe spray. We never overthin with that rate, even in the year when we had 85 to 90 degree temperatures at petal fall in the Hudson Valley. Now, generally, you don't see those high temperatures the more north we go, but even at our high temperatures, that's still a relatively safe spray. That would then be followed up at the 12 millimeter spray by another spray of NA with a slightly lower rate, same rate of carbaryl, but this rate has to be adjusted up or down based on the carbohydrate model, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Then lastly, if needed, this spray at 15 to 20 millimeters. Until now, we've said Maxell at a moderate rate, 64 ounces, 7, and oil. With the advent of these two new thinners, I think we will be recommending those two options as the best options if you get in trouble and the fruit is getting big and you haven't been able to thin it adequately. So I've talked about the carbohydrate model many times before, developed by Alan Laxo. I just want to summarize where I think it's useful. In 2022, there's both the web-based version on NUA and a mobile phone version that you can download a free app that's named MaluSim and run it on your phone. The model uses relative bloom density. So in an on year, you would say, I have 100% of my spurs are flowering. In an off year, you would put something much less. It gives you the option to adjust that. The model uses bloom date to then calculate a degree day to adjust predicted thinning efficacy according to how many degree days you are away from full bloom. And this leads us to this specific suggestion on how to time the 3 post-bloom sprays, remembering that the bloom spray we time with a pollen tube growth model. But the 3 post-bloom sprays we want to time using the MaluSim or Cornell carbohydrate thinning model on NUA, using degree days. There's a column in there I'll show in a minute, but we apply the petal fall spray when we get to 100. That's a mistake. It should be 100 to 130 degree days. The 12 millimeter spray we apply between 200 and 250 degree days. And the 18 millimeter we apply between 300 and 350 degree days. And this is base 4 degrees C, so you can't really get this degree days from any other place except for the carbohydrate model. The model will then predict thinning index or thinning efficacy using 7-day carbohydrate balance, 2 days before spraying and 4 days after spraying. I show here the curves from last year in 3 different locations in New York, just to try to illustrate how these curves change and how they're useful in predicting thinning. Let's first start in the Hudson Valley at the top one in Milton, New York. When we got to the petal fall window, and you see here the line for full bloom, it was kind of cool right after that, but then heat came. And so when we wanted to put on our petal fall spray, it was hot, a little scary. Well, no, it's cool because we had this carbohydrate, I was backwards. We had this carbohydrate surplus. It was all cool. So in the recommendations, we said thin aggressively. But then when we got to the 10 to 12 millimeter stage, there was a deficit, and that deficit was substantial due to heat. There, the carbohydrate model cautioned people to use lower rates or wait for the heat to pass. Then when we got to the last opportunity, 18 millimeter, we were back in a cool situation and the carbohydrate balance was positive, meaning we would get poor thinning. The opposite happened in Western New York and in the Hudson Valley. We got there later in Western New York, right during this big deficit. And so pedal fall thinning worked great in Western New York. We didn't overthin, but 90% of all the thinning we got from any thinning spray in 2021 in Western New York came from this pedal fall spray because there was a deficit. The Champlain Valley was just a little bit behind Western New York, and so the main part of the deficit had just passed when they got into the window, but still they got pretty decent thinning from pedal fall. But in both of these locations, the 10 millimeter, 12 millimeter spray happened during surpluses, and we got poor thinning. But then at the 18 millimeters, we got reasonable thinning if we needed it. I want to just illustrate that when you look at the carbohydrate balance model, you see a column. These are the columns at the chart. It has a chart and then the columns. And it has here the 7-day weighted average. And this is the number we really look at. But we inserted a column for degree days. And you can see that there's a black box around the degree days between 200 and 250, meaning these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days when you should try to time your main thinning spray at 10 to 12 millimeters. And then it will give you a recommendation whether to pull on the full dose. In this particular location, you can tell that the daytime temperatures during those 5 days, well, 90 on the first day, but then it went quite cool in the 60s and quite cool at night. And so the model is calling for high rates because, as you recall, during this period of time, we had a surplus of carbohydrates. And we use these degree days to time each one of the 3 sprays, as I indicated earlier. So when we look at the main thinning spray, this would have been some suggestions that I gave last year to our growers. You know, I told them a specific period of time when they should spray. Any one of the 6 days would work because high temperatures were forecast to only be in the 60s. And there would be a surplus of carbohydrates and would give mild thinning, therefore use full rates. And I told them it's unlikely that that spray is going to give enough thinning. And so you're going to probably need an 18 millimeter spray. That's the kind of information you can get by using the carbohydrate model every day during the thinning season. Now, that's not enough because you spray and then you really don't know whether what the carbohydrate model predicted actually is going to happen or did happen. But the fruit growth rate model developed by Dwayne Green is an excellent way to achieve a more solid sense of what's happening in the orchard. And we've all learned how to do this, tag spurs, measure fruitlets. The only additional thing we're suggesting now is that after the spray, you time the first measurement at 50 degree days after the spray, based upon looking at the Malusim model, and the second spray 100 degree days after application. And the Malusim fold model is an easy way to use the fruit growth rate model, and it includes error detection protocols. And so I come back to here to this chart I showed earlier. If you sprayed at the 200 degree day, suppose you sprayed on May 26th, you would then count forward. Well, when I get to 250 is when I should go back and measure. And you can see because it was cool, it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days before we should have done the first measurement. And then you would wait till you get from 200, you get to 300 to take the second measurement on the fruit growth rate model. So I'm going to end with a couple of comments here about tips for success in 2022. I think it's going to require you to assess every block for flower quality as we get into the spring season and there's some frost. You've got to assess whether the king flowers are healthy or whether they've been damaged and are missing. But even with Honeycrisp, even where some kings have been damaged, they still require thinning because it can set a wonderful crop just on lateral bloom. However, if most kings are present, you're going to need to use full rates following the carbohydrate model suggestions. Time your sprays. Petal fall between 100 and 130. Then assess your response by measuring fruits. Then spray again at the 12 millimeter stage between 200 and 250. Then assess response. And hopefully you won't need the third spray at 18 millimeters. You'll be all done. I suggest that you nozzle the sprayer differently for each spray. For both the bloom, or for the bloom spray particularly, We need to have uniform spray from the top to the bottom with ATS. Every flower cluster needs some ATS. You can't just spray the top of the tree. But for the hormone type sprays, I like to increasingly target the top. For the petal fall sprays, I like to put 1/3 only in the bottom and 2/3 of the spray in the top. When I get to the 12 millimeters, I like even more in the top, only 25% in the bottom and 75% in the top. And if I have to put on an 18 millimeter spray, I only spray the top of the tree. All the bottom half of the bank of nozzles is shut off. Just a couple of comments about Regulate. Some growers in New York routinely use Regulate. I don't like to use it routinely. It does significantly increase the response of NAA. So if there's no carbohydrate deficit, what you have is a surplus and it's going to give mild thinning, Regulate is a benefit. And so in those cases, I would include a pint of Regulate with my NaN7 spray. But on years when there's a significant carbohydrate deficit, I think it's like playing with gunpowder. It can bite you, it can get too much thinning. So I would not put any Regulate in whenever we have significant carbohydrate deficits. However, once fruits get really big and you get to the 18 millimeters, Regulate by itself doesn't help enough. You need a more potent surfactant, penetrant, and the only one that's worked well for us is oil. Now, I would hasten to add, in the next few years, as we get these two new thinners, maybe we won't have to worry so much about adding oil at the 18 millimeters. So I want to pause here and ask the hosts whether I should go on.
We have a question asking if blossom thinning adversely impacts pollinators.
We don't think so. I don't know that there's been really good studies on the pollinators, but ATS will not kill bees. It does affect the flower parts, and so it's possible that they don't collect as much pollen. But generally, the way that the ATS is timed, there's a significant amount of time from the first bloom to the first spray of ATS where bees can collect pollen and nectar. And then new flowers open after that first ATS spray, and they can continue collecting from those till the second ATS spray. But the ATS in and of itself does not kill the bees.
Is there a resource that you could share that would have a copy of the chemical thinning recommendations? This person is in Ontario and interested in comparing options.
Yes, our chemical thinning recommendations are published annually in what's called the Cornell Recommends. I think it's unfortunate that it's not an open access publication. You have to buy it, and that's a Cornell problem. They think they've got to charge for that information to pay for printing it. But it's available at the Cornell Extension offices, or you can find it if you go to the Cornell website. Additionally, each year I give webinars near thinning where I talk about specific rates. I would just comment that the rates that I've published in the Cornell Recommends are what I call the standard rate for that variety. There's a recommendation for each variety. Then the Cornell Malusim model says adjust that particular rate for that variety up or down based on the carbohydrate model. So whenever you see a recommendation on the Malusim model, it's based upon the standard rate that's published in Cornell Recommends up or down a certain percentage. Or you can just use what you've used in the past and feel comfortable with adjusting it up or down.
Thank you. There's another question here in terms of where can we find recommended bud load for other varieties, for example, Gala or Fuji?
So we've published recommended bud loads for those two varieties. For Gala, because of the fruit size issued for us in New York, we did this study comparing Washington and New York, and Washington can outproduce in size at any crop load New York by a long shot. So leaving too many buds on Gala is even worse than it is with Honeycrisp. So we have a lower target threshold there of 1.5 number of buds for final fruit number. Fuji, however, we have used the same 1.8 ratio that we use with Honeycrisp because of its biennial bearing nature.
There was a question asking if the degree day range for thinning are just Honeycrisp or for all varieties.
Those degree day ranges were developed for all varieties. The ones that was developed with were Gala, Macintosh, Delicious, and then Honeycrisp. We haven't specifically looked at the other varieties, but in general, they all tend to grow in relation to degree days so that they get to the fruit size in those degree day ranges that I've mentioned.
Why do you prefer ATS over NAA for thinning at bloom?
Primarily because of the test results where we've tended to get more return bloom out of ATS sprays than NAA sprays. NAA sprays at bloom are safer, has very little thinning activity. Sometimes we get a little bit of thinning. NAD works the same, but in terms of return bloom, we've gotten better response out of ATS. Now, that relates to the third part of my presentation that I didn't give, but I'll just briefly in an answer. If we can kill the entire flower with an ATS spray, it doesn't have any seeds that develop, and these seeds produce GA, which is detrimental to return bloom. And that's why I think ATS tends to be a little better in terms of promoting return bloom than does NAA.
The next question is, what do you think of Provide as an early thinner on Fujis and Galas when using it for russeting?
So we have seen some mild thinning action from Provide, particularly on Sweet Tango, but also on other varieties. For a variety like Sweet Tango, which naturally self-thins, Provide gives all the thinning you need. But for other varieties, when used for a russet control program, it does reduce the rate you need to spray of Maxell and 7. We've shown that very clearly with Golden Delicious, but also with other varieties. If you're spraying 2 to 3 sprays of Provide, you can reduce the rate of Maxell and 7 that you spray for thinning, but you will never get enough thinning out of the Provide alone.
So the next question is, have any factors been identified that impact return bloom sprays?
Yes, and that's in the third part of my presentation. If you stick around, you'll hear it all.
Is there any oil formulation or lighter rates that is less of an issue regarding damage with recent Captan applications?
The issue of oil in these sprays is a problem because we spray so much Captan in the East. Now, for lime sulfur and fish oil, it is an issue spraying oil before a Captan spray at petal fall, because the problem is that the oil is such a powerful penetrant, it takes Captan into the plant. So Captan getting into the plant is the problem. But even when we use oil at the 18 millimeter, if we spray Maxell 7 on oil as a rescue treatment, that oil causes problems if Captan is sprayed before it or after it. So this is a real problem. And it's one of the reasons I wish we could get away from oil. Too many people don't think in advance because you have to avoid spraying Captan at least 5 days before you were to spray oil in a thinning spray, and for at least 5 days after. That's a 10-day window without Captan. No oil has shown to be less of a problem than others with Captan. They all are penetrants, even the ultra-fine summer spray oils. Now, maybe there is a really light oil that I've never looked at, but all the ones that we looked at seem to give us problems with Captan if it's sprayed in the vicinity of that spray, partly because oil sticks around. You spray it and it's there for a Captan spray 3 days later. Or the Captan sticks around and it's there for the oil to help go into the plant 3 days later.
Do you think Geneva rootstocks, specifically 11 and 41, influence fruit set? They tend to have lighter crops than M9 and B9 across all varieties. Should we adjust thinner rates?
So in terms of their actual fruit set, we've not been able to measure lighter fruit set. If both of those varieties, rootstocks, tend to grow more vigorously in the first few years, then fruit set will generally be a little lighter. But when we look at over the course of a 10-year cycle, we don't see that. But if you're seeing that, it would obviously argue for a lighter thinning rate. Now, this goes back to something we learned many, many years ago, and maybe it's worth repeating. When we first started moving from M7 type trees or 111 type central leader trees to M9, we had more and more trouble thinning the M9s than we used to have with the M7s or 111s. And what we attributed it to was just the difference in vigor. A more vigorous tree will thin easier than a tree that has lost all its vigor. Now, one of the problems with M9 in particular, and then B9 even worse, is that if they get older and lose vigor, they become extremely hard to thin. Our answer to that has been more aggressive pruning to get the bud number down to where we can balance vegetative growth and cropping and not have it be too heavily weighted one way or the other.
Terence, this is Renee. I have seen something similar with Geneva 214, where it just sets extremely heavy crop loads, even though its vigor is similar to G11 and G41. And consequently, I've seen some extreme variations in yield from year to year. And I don't know how to control the crop load on that particular rootstock.
Well, I think that if that's what you're seeing in the main climate, which is a cooler growing climate than what we have, the vigor is maybe on the lower side. I think it requires more aggressive pruning in the on year, like we've said, to get bud numbers down. And this sort of precision pruning will help a lot, because then when you come back and thin, you can get it down to the right number. Now, what I said earlier, I just repeat that no matter what, if you start with too many buds and they all set, no matter how well you thin, we never seem to do it right. I just kick myself, and I don't kick myself, I just get frustrated when I go around at harvest to different orchard blocks and they thinned what they thought was perfect, but I do counts on those trees at harvest and they're twice as many as they should be. Maybe the fruit still looks okay. The quality's not perfect, but it still looks okay, but they just shot themselves in the foot for next year, thinking that they had got the fruit number down to the right, but they didn't. And then I almost want to cry with them the next spring when there's just not enough flowers on the tree. So I routinely find too many Honeycrisp trees or fruits on the trees at harvest in the on year.
Another comment, I have seen Geneva 41 set fewer fruit than other rootstocks with the same vigor, and I've also seen the impacts on these fruit in storage where they develop hideous bitter pit. So I think this comment about Geneva 41, at least in my orchards, is probably true.
Yeah, if you listen to some of my recent rootstock talks, and I'm giving another one at the webinar, and I just should plug it here, on the 1st of March, no, is it for 20th of February? 1st of March, somewhere in there, the Root to Fruit project will be having sort of a final webinar. I'm giving a summary of all of the rootstock work, and that's one of the things we'll comment on is the differences among rootstocks and their bitter pit susceptibility. And it does relate to vigor. And one of the findings of the Root to Fruit project is that vigor is related to bitter pit. So if in your case, G41 is vigorous, you have to find ways to slow it down. And it does require a different fertilization strategy than does M9, much lower nitrogen levels and much lower potassium levels.
That makes sense. So Michael Bazadow just posted the announcement or the link to the Root to Fruit webinar, and I believe I did get an announcement in my email today. So I think that's it for questions. If you want to resume the presentation or mention more details about your Root to Fruit webinar, proceed.
Well, let me go through this last part. It's really, I think, a critical piece of what I'm trying to say today. And that is this issue of return bloom. It's one of the greatest challenges with Honeycrisp, and it has huge economic consequences. I've preached a lot about doing precision pruning, but my first bulleted point is that precision pruning in and of itself does not ensure good return bloom, nor does it ensure resting spurs. Let's suppose you prune to what I suggested, 131 flowering spurs, but you essentially in an on year, that's all the spurs and you're only leaving 131. It's hard to get some of those to be resting spurs because even though you thin, there's still one apple hanging on there, the king. And so then you have no resting spurs. And for managing return bloom, resting spurs with Honeycrisp is an important point. You need some resting spurs. Secondly, I preached about bloom thinning, and it has consistently improved return bloom. But if flower bud is too low or is too high, it doesn't ensure return bloom either, nor does it ensure resting spurs, because with bloom thinning, we're trying to thin all the lateral flowers off and leave just one, but it still doesn't give us resting spurs. Now, petal fall sprays have consistently improved return bloom only when flower bud load is not too high. If flower bud load is too high in the beginning, it seems like you cross a threshold and the tree just won't flower. Petal fall sprays also do not ensure resting spurs. And the last problem has been that our recommendation for summer return bloom sprays has given inconsistent results. Some years there's a benefit and some years we show almost no benefit. This has been a bugaboo for us ever since I started working on Honeycrisp. And I think maybe in the last 4 or 5 years, I've started to understand better. And I tried to teach this a year ago for the first time, and I'll try to teach it again today. I show here a drawing of a spur that was produced by our anatomist at Geneva named Martin Goffinet. So the spur exists on a branch, and the way a spur inside the bud exists, these leaf primordia are already inside the bud, and then these floral primordia are already inside the bud. So when the bud opens, all the primary spur leaves were already there, they just expand, and the fruits were already all there. But there is a lateral bud that's dormant in the axil of the first spur leaf, and it grows what's called the bore shoot. That bore shoot often grows a short amount, and then it forms a bud for the next year, and inside that bud are primary spur leaves again, and then this terminal part of flowering. Now, as the spur develops each year, these spurs generally stop growing early. By full bloom, almost all of them have stopped, these bore shoots. And so then they continue to develop inside the bud, invisible to us. And this little stalk keeps growing, and it has to grow at least 10 nodes long to set a terminal flower cluster. When we don't get flowering, we don't get that development. And what we have is the appearance of an anti-flowering hormone called gibberellin. So gibberellins are produced in the seeds of these little tiny fruits. They're exported down the stem of the fruit into the spur base itself. This is called the borse base. And then they're transported up this bore shoot, and they inhibit flower initiation up on the tip of that spur bore shoot that's developing for next year. Cytokinins, in contrast, are produced in the roots, and they come up this way. Or ethylene, they promote flower initiation in this terminal bud. And so when we spray ethylene or cytokinins, we can get a stimulation of flowering. And it's the balance between gibberellins and other hormones that determines whether this tip turns floral. And so that balance is what is critical for us, and especially in the early part of the season, and especially with Honeycrisp, determining whether this bud is going to become stay vegetative or turn floral. Now, 3 other points. The total number of seeds of all these little fruits here is the important factor to consider. They are potent little factories producing GA in this plant. In years when there's a lot of blossoms on Honeycrisp tree, and then every one of those little fruit sets, at least for a few weeks till we can thin them off, they're all potent little factories of GA, exporting GA locally into the bore shoot, but also down into the stem and to surrounding spurs, prohibiting flower formation. GA levels in that kind of year are extremely high. And that's what we're facing in 2022. Lastly, other years, in the off year, for example, or suppose there was some event that knocks out most of the seeds in the fruit, and we have 2 or 3 seeds per fruit instead of 10 per fruit, then the amount of seed produced GA is lower. And the natural positive effect of auxins and cytokinins and ethylene will cause these lateral buds to be floral. So GA becomes a critical factor. And I've said last year that I want you to think about the seed load per tree, not the flower bud load per tree. Because excessive flower buds produce excessive gibberellins. And just 2 examples to show you the impact. Let's suppose the first example, you pruned it the way we're suggesting, 131 flowers, regardless of how many it had to start with. Every one of those flowering spurs has 5 fruits, and every one of those fruits potentially has 10 seeds. That's a potential 6,550 seeds on that tree, each one a potent little GA factory. That's a lot, but let's look at what happens when you don't prune like we suggest. Let's suppose you left 300 flowering spurs, each one with 5 fruits, each one with 10 seeds. That's 15,000 seeds producing GA. GA. And in those years, no matter what you do, no matter what you spray for summer sprays, you can't overcome 15,000 seeds of GA, and you get little flowering the next year. That's why blossom thinning is so important for Honeycrisp. The excess number of fruits that early produces so much GA that you can't overcome it. But with blossom thinning, particularly with ATS, where you kill a bunch of the lateral flowers, leaving only the king if you do it right, the total number of seeds is quickly reduced at bloom down to a more manageable number. And I give two examples here again. The one that was precision pruned, a 73 target, 131 we started with, 131 clusters times 5 gives you 650 initial fruits. But let's suppose you blossom thin and then thin it to petal fall, and you could reduce it down to the target number quickly. That's only 730 seeds per tree. But the other grower, lightly pruned, left a couple hundred, 220 flowering spurs instead of 131. That gives 1,100 initial fruits, and then didn't thin very well. Even if he did thin down to one fruit, he still has 2,000 seeds producing GA. Therefore, the combination of precision pruning and blossom thinning is an excellent way to get the seed number down to a reasonable level that you can then influence it with artificial sprays of ethereal or NAA. The second point was discovered by Pollyanna when I was gone, and I really credit her for doing this work. She looked at when flowers initiate in Honeycrisp. And we've always said that it's 4 to 6 weeks after bloom. And that fits for most varieties, Goldens, Empires, Max, that all happens in July-ish. Therefore, we've recommended for many years to begin a series of summer NAA or ethereal sprays starting the longest day of the year, the latter part of June. But with Honeycrisp, at least in the year she did this work, Honeycrisp had already gone through the process, and our summer ethereal or NAA sprays are too late. Oh, excuse me. Gala, on the other hand, you can influence it by summer sprays really late. And many of these other varieties, in fact, Fuji, you can influence it by traditionally timed NAA or ethereal sprays. And so I've asked the question for years. I've done every year since about the year 2000, a return bloom trial with ethereal and NAA. I would say about half the years I get a response, but half the years I get no improvement in return bloom. And I say, why are they so inconsistent? And I think we've discovered why. First, for return bloom to sprays to work, the number of seeds producing GA cannot be excessive, because once it's excessive, no matter what you spray, you can't overcome that massive amount of GA inhibiting flowering. Thus, the combination of precision pruning and bloom thinning. But secondly, because of the earliness of flower initiation of Honeycrisp, our sprays are often too late. So for many years, we've recommended 4 summer sprays spaced 10 days apart, beginning June 21st, the longest day of the year, of either 10 parts of NAA or a pint of ethereal. This timing usually is after the thinning period is over, when fruits are bigger than 25 millimeters. And that's sort of been a target. Don't spray these sprays before, because you might thin, and maybe you don't want the thinning. But with Honeycrisp's situation, where it has its flower initiation early, and it relates to how quickly these bore shoots stop growing visibly and set a terminal bud, even though inside that bud they're still developing. In fact, I challenge anybody to go out and look at your Honeycrisp trees right at full bloom and see how many bore shoots are still growing. Or certainly by petal fall, almost all the bore shoots have stopped. And so that's the point when this flower initiation becomes important. And so we think, and this is again a little bit of a going out on a limb for me, because I've only tested it 2 years, but it's such a critical thing. I hate to see growers go through 2022 and then come back in 2023 with no bloom. We're suggesting starting these early, or these return bloom sprays earlier. And this assumes that you have the seed load down by proper pruning and proper bloom thinning. But start these and to use ethereal, not just NAA, but to use ethereal at 10-day intervals starting when fruits are 16 millimeters. So if everything worked perfect, you would spray your bloom ATS, your petal fall NaN7, your 12 millimeters NaN7, and then the next week, start this series of 4 sprays of ethereal basically every week. Now, there's this big caution. Until the fruits get 25 millimeters, you can get thinning out of ethereal. And ethereal is extremely temperature dependent. If the temperatures are hot and you spray these return bloom sprays early, you could potentially knock a lot of fruit on the ground that you didn't want to knock on the ground. So I'm putting in this caution. Don't spray these early ethereal sprays when fruits are between 15 and before they get to 25 millimeters if temperatures are above 85. The curve for ethafon just goes exponential up. At 80, it's really potent. At 85, it's twice as potent. At 90, it's about 10 times as potent. So you've got to really be careful with high temperatures and ethereal. A spray program that we would suggest, and this is me going out on a huge limb, because like I said, I've only tested it 2 years. It's worked well. I haven't thinned off. It's all aimed at getting return bloom. ATS at 2 times during bloom, based on the pollen tube growth model, to knock out a lot of seeds so that my seed number quickly drops. Then NAA 7.5 to 10 parts at petal fall. That's about a week after. Down at the bottom, you see the weekdays. It's about a weekly intervals, basically. Then come in with NAA and 7 at the 10 to 12 millimeter. I didn't write the 7 in there on those NA and 10 millimeters. I should have. But then about a week after that, start these low doses of ethereal. I'm suggesting the first one be a half pint per acre. Then the next 3, a full pint to the acre. First at the 15 to 18 millimeters, then at the 22 to 25, then at the 30 to 33, and then 35 millimeters. That takes you about till the end of the first week of July. By that time, flower initiation of Honeycrisp should be all over. So let me conclude the entire talk. I think pruning to an optimum bud number will help reduce biennial bearing of Honeycrisp and improve quality, but it's not the be end all. It won't solve the problem. Pruning at 1.8 buds is our recommended pruning severity. It hopefully balances vegetative growth and cropping so we don't get the trees vigorous and they don't get too weak with excessive flowering. I think blossom thinning is essential to control biennial bearing. I like ATS. I think it's fairly safe. It will often burn spur leaves. In fact, I like to see some spur leaf damage just to know that I got it on right, but it doesn't damage fruit finish. And it sometimes doesn't work at all, it seems like, but it is knocking out some seeds, which helps us in biennial bearing. We have to think not in terms of fruit number per tree, but seed number per tree and seed number per spur. With 5 fruitlets in a spur and each fruitlet having 10 seeds, that's a lot of seeds on one spur, and that spur will not flower again the next year. But if you can thin it down to 1 fruit per spur early, and maybe you don't set all 10 seeds, you end up with many fewer seeds that you can overcome than with sequential sprays of ethereal to induce return bloom. These early timings for return bloom sprays are more likely to stimulate flower initiation than the later. They carry some risk of over thinning under hot temperatures. I put them out there for you to consider. You decide whether you want to try this or not, but I think it helps us understand how we can get to a better annual cropping. I don't want 100% bloom ever on Honeycrisp. I want just about 50 to 60% of the spurs every year to flower, so I have resting spurs. My take-home messages for you in 2022 are do precision pruning. I like the 2-step process. You got to know how many apples you want. You have to decide that based on the potential you see for your orchard, whether it's 1,000 bushel orchard, 1,200 bushel orchard, 1,400 bushel orchard. You have to decide that and then calculate how many buds to leave. I like to prune Honeycrisp or at least give a final touch-up between green tip and half-inch green or maybe up to full bloom. I like to count afterwards. And I hope that our counting method with computer vision will allow this to be done automatically without a lot of work in the next few years. A strong proponent of precision chemical thinning using the 3 models, the pollen tube growth model, the carbohydrate model, and measuring fruit diameters. to use the fruit growth rate model. I will add that we're working in this national project on 2 alternative ways to actually measuring the diameter of fruits, or 3 of them actually. One is using a cell phone to take pictures of those and send them to a company that's now offering this as a service, a fruit scouting company. And as long as you don't mind taking hundreds of cell phone pictures and sending them, you won't have to measure a single apple. There are 2 other methods. One's developing by Todd Einhorn and one's by Tan Khan, that I think have great potential that will, I hope, allow us to mount and measure an instrument on this rover, drive down the row and have it tell us how many fruit are falling off. In the meantime, I hate for you to go through another year and say, I'm sick of measuring fruits and not do it, but risk $1 million by getting it wrong. Number 3, we suggest, and I hesitate to really recommend because I don't want to get anybody in trouble with this, but I think that it is a sound approach to apply these 4 weekly sprays of ethereal beginning at 16 millimeters, really watching the temperatures. And then, of course, we follow up with precision hand thinning after fruits are 25 millimeters, doing it as early as possible to get seed number down so that any flowers that initiate near the end of June and early July in Honeycrisp can benefit from early hand thinning. This new automation project I'm really enthused about. We hope that an autonomous vehicle could drive up and down your rows, count dormant flower buds, count flower buds at green tip, count them at pink, count them at bloom, count them when they're 20 millimeters, count them when they're bigger, count them pre-harvest. But not only that, to then store that information for each tree in a separate data point that could identify the tree when the worker approaches that tree with, say, something like Google Glass, or maybe just a sensor on their phone so they know what tree they're looking at, and then tell them on that tree, hand thin off X or don't thin anything off. And at some point in the future, I'm optimistic that there will be autonomous vehicles, robotic type of thinning that will both count the number of fruits on the tree and then take off the ones we don't need. So that's longer than I had hoped, but thank you for sticking with it. And I'd be happy to stick around for a few more questions or let everybody go.
Thanks, Terence. I think there are a few questions. I'll start at the bottom and work back up. Have you seen some blocks of Honeycrisp with several consecutive years of poor flowering? And do you know what causes this?
So that's like the worst possible situation. And let me just add that there is a philosophy that possibly you could spray gibberellin in the on year to stop flowering, or in the off year to stop too much flowering. Sounds good in practice, but what if you get 2 off years? You inhibit flowering too much, then you really shoot yourself in the foot. This lack of flowering with a second year in a row, I believe, relates to too much gibberellin in the tree, whether it's by too much, because I didn't emphasize this point, but nitrogen stimulates growth. And gibberellins are also produced in rapidly growing shoot tips. So strong shoot growth, more than a foot in Honeycrisp, is part of the problem. It also impacts the bore shoot, because if the bore shoot bud itself is producing gibberellin, it's growing vigorously, it will be very difficult to get that one to be floral. I don't understand all the reasons why this back-to-back happens, but that's one of the reasons I'm so anxious to do everything I can to make sure it doesn't happen. And I think the early return bloom sprays of ethereal will help ensure that this doesn't happen.
Thanks. Next question. On Honeycrisp and its crosses, they naturally produce a lot of Y branches. Should a full simplified branches, I'm not sure what the question is. Should a full simplified branches be pruned on off years?
So that's a question of the pruning strategy, where we do have generally fairly wide branch angles and maybe not a lot of secondary branching. They're already sort of columnarized. Like Spur Delicious would do that naturally for us. The strategy of pruning out any branch larger than 3/4 of an inch, I think, is very sound, and it keeps trees from getting too vigorous as time goes on. I've said many times, and I'll repeat it here because it's a separate talk, large branches produce large trees. If you allow any of your trees to get branches that are too big, more than 1.5 inches in diameter and high density, you end up losing control of that system. So you have to just be at it every year, pruning out 1 or 2 branches. But if you do it every year, you almost never have branches bigger than 1 inch in diameter. Now, the second part of that question is, do I need to prune off secondary branches to columnarize it? I think that depends on the bud load. I use that strategy as a way to drop buds on the ground. On a year where bloom is low and I need every flower out there, I'm only going to take out just the worst offending branch that's now 2 inches in diameter. I got to get it out of there, but I'm not going to take off any of the laterals on the remaining branches. But on years with high bud load, I have to take off more buds. And taking off these lateral branches on the main branch is a quick way to rapidly put buds on the ground and get me down to a reasonable number. Because if I don't do that, I have to cut individual spurs off, and that just takes more time. So it's just a rapid way to accomplish the goal.
Okay, next question. It's also kind of confusing, but I'll read it. Would it be possible to preload Honeycrisp with cytokinin to overcome the very high BA load present so early? Now, I think maybe they meant GA load because cytokinin is a BA.
Yeah, I think you're right. So it's pretty interesting that you can spray cytokinins before bloom at peak, and you can start to stimulate cell division and get bigger fruit size out of it if the temperatures are there, because cytokinin is so dependent on temperatures. But it will be gone and metabolized by the time these seeds just start pumping out the GA in these potent little factories. So there's almost no way to preload flowering inducing hormones to counteract that GA. The only real way is to get the seeds off, either by thinning them off by hand or by chemical thinning, or one way or another, to get the seed number down to a reasonable number. I should have added that there are a few growers in Washington, I think they're crazy, but it works. They put an army out there to hand thin Honeycrisp at bloom to a single cluster, and it works for return bloom. They're very able in that way to get seed number down to a reasonable number. But it takes hundreds of people.
Yeah, I have seen at harvest time when I cut up lots of Honeycrisp that they more often than not have a full seed cavity, whereas Macintosh will have 1 or 2 or 5 seeds. So
let me just say something about that, because NAA has some properties of seed abortion. It will cause some seed abortion. So possibly some of the benefit we get from NAA at bloom is that it might limit the number of seeds per fruit. To instead of 10, maybe you only have 6. That's better in terms of Honeycrisp and return bloom. So I don't totally discount NA at bloom. I just seem to have had better real world success with ATS at bloom for return bloom than NA at bloom.
maybe it's in preventing the seeds in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is the last question. When is flower bud initiation in Evercrisp?
I wish I knew. I wish Pollyanna had come back and work for me. It's just so great that she'd do all this work and I could just report the results. But it's interesting that Honeycrisp and then some of its children, I think, have earlier flower bud initiation than others. I think that Snapdragon and Sweet Tango have earlier flowering, but we've not looked at Evercrisp, something we should do or somebody should do.
So I think that's it for the questions.
So Renee, I'd just like to make a quick plug. We've
Sure.
got some upcoming meetings, and I put the links to those for more information and to sign up for them in the chat box. You can check those out there. We have 3 different in-person pruning meetings with Terence here in Eastern New York. And certainly if anybody from Western New England's looking to make a drive, you're welcome to join us too. Those will be next Thursday and Friday, and then another one the following week. And then if you want to learn more about those newer models that Terence was talking about, the pollen tube growth model, the fruit growth rate model, the carbohydrate model, we're having an in-depth workshop on those on March 18th. And we're also going to be talking more about those new thinners that he mentioned, Acid and Metametrin. So please consider joining us for those. Thanks.
I'd like to personally thank you, Terence, for doing this presentation that's jam-packed with good information. And thanks to everybody else who came today.